Most people believe peace comes from controlling their emotions, from staying strong, staying calm, staying composed, no matter what happens inside. So when sadness appears, they try to fix it. When anger rises, they push it down. When anxiety whispers in the background, they rush to silence it before anyone notices. But here's the quiet truth very few people talk about. The mind often becomes restless, not because emotions exist, but because we spend so much energy trying to escape them. Strangely enough, the moment we stop fighting what we feel, something unexpected begins to happen. The tension softens, the thoughts slow down, and the mind, almost as if relieved, finally begins to relax. In this story, you'll meet a man who spent years trying to keep his emotions sealed away, believing that control was the path to peace. Until one small, simple lesson, shared by a quiet stranger in a park, changed the way he understood his own mind. It all began with something surprisingly ordinary, a simple glass jar and a lid that had been tightened far too much. There was a quiet kind of battle that Elias fought most days, though no one around him ever seemed to notice. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It lived somewhere behind his eyes, in the tight space between thoughts and feelings. Whenever a difficult emotion appeared, anger, embarrassment, loneliness, he immediately tried to push it away, as if feelings were uninvited guests that could simply be shown the door. But emotions, as he was slowly discovering, don't leave just because they're told to. They linger, they circle back, and sometimes they sit quietly in the corner of the mind, waiting. Elias would lie awake at night replaying moments from the day, a careless remark from a coworker, a message that never came, a small disappointment that somehow grew heavy. He believed the problem was his thinking, so he thought harder. He analyzed every reaction, every feeling, every little sting of the heart. Surely, he told himself, if he just understood it well enough, he could make it disappear. But strangely, the more he tried to solve his emotions like puzzles, the more tangled everything seemed to become. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Elias noticed something curious. The harder he argued with what he felt, the louder it seemed to echo inside him. It was a bit like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The pressure only built stronger, pushing back against his grip. His mind grew tired, but the feelings remained. And somewhere in that quiet exhaustion, a small question began to rise. A gentle one, almost hesitant. What if the mind didn't need to win the argument at all? What if, just for a moment, the heart was allowed to speak without interruption? Not that Elias had any idea how to do that yet, but the question had already begun to open a door. The question stayed with Elias longer than he expected. It followed him quietly through the next morning, lingering somewhere between his thoughts as he walked to work. At first he tried to ignore it, the way one brushes aside a drifting cloud. Yet the question returned with gentle persistence, almost as if it were patiently waiting for him to slow down enough to hear it. What if the struggle itself was the thing exhausting him? For years, Elias had believed peace came from controlling his inner world. If sadness appeared, he corrected it. If anger surfaced, he pushed it down. If anxiety whispered in the background, he rushed to silence it with logic. It seemed reasonable at the time. After all, who wants to feel uncomfortable emotions wandering freely through their day? But lately, something about that approach felt strangely backwards. It was as if his mind had been running an endless tug-of-war with his own heart. One side pulling, the other resisting, both growing more tired by the hour. And the rope, well, the rope never actually moved. The feelings remained right where they were, only now wrapped in tension and frustration. One afternoon, while sitting alone with a cup of cooling tea, Elias noticed a quiet pattern. On the rare moments when he stopped arguing with what he felt, even just for a few seconds, something subtle shifted. The pressure softened. His breathing slowed without effort. The storm in his head didn't vanish, but it seemed to loosen its grip. It was a small realization, almost easy to overlook. Perhaps the mind relaxes not when it wins the fight, but when it finally stops fighting reality altogether. Perhaps peace begins much earlier than most people think. Right at the moment a feeling is simply allowed to exist, without being labeled good or bad, useful or inconvenient. Elias didn't fully understand it yet. The idea felt unfamiliar, like holding a key without knowing which door it might open. Still, something inside him sensed that this quiet shift, this simple act of allowing, might change more than he expected. Of course, Elias had no idea how deeply his own emotions had already begun shaping his life. or how long he had been carrying them without realizing it. Most people who knew Elias would have described him as calm, dependable, the sort of person who rarely raised his voice and almost never showed irritation. If someone spoke sharply to him, he simply nodded. If disappointment arrived, he carried on with quiet composure. From the outside, it looked like emotional strength, but the truth lived somewhere much quieter. Inside, Elias had become a careful collector of unspoken feelings. Each awkward conversation, each small rejection, each careless comment from a stranger, he stored them away like objects he didn't know where to place. He told himself it was maturity, better to stay composed, better to remain steady than to let emotions spill everywhere. Still, something strange had begun happening. At night, when the world finally softened into silence, his mind refused to rest. Thoughts wandered in circles. His chest carried a faint tightness he couldn't explain. Sometimes a simple memory, a critical remark, a forgotten invitation, a moment of embarrassment, would return with surprising force. He would sit on the edge of his bed and whisper to himself, "This shouldn't bother you." Yet the feeling remained. Elias had developed a quiet fear that many people carry but rarely name. He worried that if he truly allowed himself to feel everything inside him, the emotions might spill out in ways he couldn't control. What if the sadness didn't stop? What if anger stayed too long? What if the door opened and never closed again? So instead, he did what he had always done. He kept everything contained. And though Elias couldn't see it yet, something inside him had begun to behave very much like a tightly sealed container, one slowly filling with pressure, quietly waiting for someone to notice what was building beneath the surface. Elias began noticing the pressure during ordinary moments. Not during crises, not during arguments, just in the quiet spaces of the day. Standing in line for coffee, sitting in traffic while the red light lingered a little too long. It felt subtle at first, like a faint tightening in his chest, the kind you might ignore if you're busy enough. One afternoon, while tidying a forgotten corner of his apartment, he found an old glass jar tucked inside a cabinet. It had a heavy metal lid and a narrow neck, the kind used long ago for preserving things. Curious, he picked it up and turned it slowly in his hands, noticing how tightly the lid sealed the empty space inside. Something about it made him pause. The jar reminded him of his own quiet habit. Every uncomfortable emotion, every sting of criticism, every lonely evening, every moment he swallowed words he wished he had said, seemed to disappear into an invisible container inside him. He didn't release them. He simply closed the lid and carried on. At first, that seemed to work, but over time, the jar in his imagination began to feel full. Each new feeling added pressure, like air slowly building in a sealed space. The more he tried to keep everything contained, the tighter the lid seemed to hold, and strangely enough, the effort of keeping it closed was starting to exhaust him. Elias even laughed softly to himself one evening, holding the real jar in his kitchen. If feelings were air, he murmured, this thing would have exploded by now. The thought was half a joke, though his tired smile hinted that it might not be entirely untrue. What he didn't know yet was that somewhere in the city, someone understood jars like this very well, and understood what happens when pressure inside them is finally allowed to breathe. A few days later, Elias carried the jar with him without quite knowing why. It sat loosely in his bag as he walked through the park on his way home, the evening air calm and slightly cool. The paths were quiet, and the slow rhythm of his footsteps felt strangely comforting after a long day of holding himself together. He eventually stopped at a small wooden bench beneath an old tree. As he sat there turning the jar slowly in his hands, an elderly man nearby watched him with mild curiosity. The man had the kind of calm presence that seemed to soften the space around him, like someone who had long ago stopped rushing through life. After a moment, the man smiled gently and nodded toward the jar. "Careful with that," he said with a warm chuckle. "Those things tend to hold more than people expect." Elias blinked, surprised. "It's empty," he replied, giving the jar a small shake as if to prove it. But the man's eyes held a quiet knowing, the kind that made Elias feel as though the conversation had already begun, long before the words arrived. The man said softly. "Empty jars can still carry a lot of pressure." The words lingered between them, simple but oddly precise. Elias found himself explaining, almost without planning to, how the jar reminded him of something inside himself, the way feelings piled up, the way he sealed them away to stay composed. the way his mind had grown tired trying to keep everything contained. The old man listened without interruption. No quick advice, no corrections, no lectures, just quiet attention, like someone allowing space for something important to unfold. When Elias finished, the man simply rested his hands on his knees and spoke in the same gentle tone. "You know," he said, "feelings are a bit like air in a jar. They were never meant to stay trapped forever. When we stop being afraid of them, the pressure inside the mind tends to soften on its own." Elias turned the jar slowly again, the metal lid catching the last light of the evening, and for the first time, he began to wonder what might happen if that lid were loosened, even just a little. The old man reached gently toward the jar in Elias's hands, not taking it, just resting a finger on the lid as if greeting an old friend. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The park had grown quieter, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called softly before settling into the evening. "Watch this," the man said, his voice calm and unhurried. He slowly twisted the lid, just enough to loosen it, not fully open, just a slight shift. The faintest click echoed in the glass. Elias noticed something strange in his own body as he watched. His shoulders dropped a little, as if they had been waiting for that sound. "You see," the man continued, "most people believe the jar must stay sealed, or everything inside will burst out and take over." He smiled gently. "But pressure doesn't leave through force. It leaves through space." Elias stared at the jar, his fingers still wrapped around it. The lid hadn't flown off. Nothing chaotic had happened. The jar simply rested there, calm, stable, almost relieved. "Feelings work the same way," the man said softly. "When we fight them, we tighten the lid. When we allow them, even just a little, something inside us begins to breathe." The idea settled quietly into Elias's mind. He thought of all the nights he had spent arguing with his emotions, trying to push them away or explain them into silence. Perhaps the struggle itself had been tightening the seal all along. The man stood slowly from the bench, stretching his back with a soft laugh. "Next time something difficult appears," he added gently, "try this instead. Take one slow breath. Notice the feeling. Don't chase it away, and don't feed it either. Just loosen the lid." Elias looked down at the jar again, turning it thoughtfully in his hands. Somewhere deep inside, something small had shifted. Not a dramatic change, more like the quiet release of a knot that had been pulled tight for far too long. Still, he wondered what it would actually feel like to try this in real life, especially when the next difficult moment inevitably arrived. The next morning didn't feel dramatically different. The sky looked the same, the streets carried the same quiet rhythm, and Elias still woke with the familiar heaviness in his chest. For a moment he almost dismissed the conversation in the park as a pleasant but distant thought. Then something small happened. While making coffee, he accidentally spilled a little on the counter. Normally he would sigh in quiet irritation, perhaps mutter something under his breath, and quickly move on while pretending the frustration wasn't there. But this time he paused. The memory of the jar drifted back into his mind. He closed his eyes for just a moment and imagined loosening the lid. The feeling was still there, annoyance, a slight tension behind his forehead, but he didn't push it away. He simply noticed it. One slow breath in, one slow breath out. Strangely enough, the pressure didn't grow stronger. It softened, like air quietly leaving a container that had been sealed too tightly. Throughout the day, he tried the same gentle experiment. When a colleague spoke sharply during a meeting, he felt the familiar spark of embarrassment rising in his chest. Instead of wrestling with it, he simply acknowledged it in silence. "There you are," he thought quietly, as if greeting a passing wave. And just like that, something curious happened. The emotion moved. Not instantly, not dramatically, but it moved. The tightness loosened. His thoughts stopped racing. It felt a little like opening a window in a warm room and allowing fresh air to circulate again. That evening, as Elias placed the glass jar on his kitchen table, he noticed something almost amusing. For the first time in a long while, his mind felt lighter. Not perfectly calm, not completely free of emotion, but no longer bracing itself against every feeling that appeared. And somewhere deep inside, the invisible jar that had once felt ready to burst now seemed far more stable, as if the simple act of allowing had quietly changed the pressure within. A few days later, Elias found himself in a moment that would once have tightened the lid immediately. He was standing outside a small cafe, phone in hand, reading a message that felt colder than he expected. A brief reply from someone he cared about, short, distant, almost careless. His chest tightened instantly. The old reflex appeared like clockwork. Explain it. Fix it. Push the feeling away before it grows. For a second, his mind began its familiar rush of interpretations. Maybe you said something wrong. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you shouldn't feel this at all. Then he remembered the jar. Elias slipped the phone into his pocket and leaned lightly against the cafe wall. Just for a moment, the world moved around him. People walking past, quiet conversations drifting through the air. But inside, he did something different. He imagined the lid turning gently. He noticed the feeling instead of arguing with it, the small sting of rejection, the warmth in his chest, the quiet urge to defend himself. Instead of tightening against it, he took one slow breath and let the feeling sit beside him like a passing traveler. Something remarkable happened. The emotion didn't vanish, but it softened its edges. The sharpness faded into something more understandable, almost human. Elias realized the feeling wasn't trying to control him. It was simply asking to be acknowledged. A few moments later, when he finally picked up his phone again, his response was different, slower, clearer. No reaction rushed by wounded pride, no heavy silence built from avoidance. Just a simple, thoughtful reply. And as he walked away from the cafe, Elias noticed something quietly powerful. When the jar inside him wasn't sealed shut, life itself seemed easier to carry. One quiet evening, Elias sat at his kitchen table with the glass jar resting in front of him. The room was still, the kind of gentle silence that settles after a long day. He turned the jar slowly in his hands, remembering how tightly he once believed it had to stay sealed. For a moment he simply watched his own breathing. Then he did something the old man had suggested without even realizing it had become a small ritual. He paused, closed his eyes, and asked himself a simple question. What am I feeling right now? Not what he should feel, not what would make sense, just what was there. The answer was rarely dramatic. Sometimes it was a faint tiredness, sometimes a touch of loneliness after a quiet evening, occasionally a small frustration from something someone had said hours earlier. Instead of pushing it away, he simply named it in his mind, like placing a label on a jar resting on a shelf. Then came the small part that changed everything. One slow breath in, one slow breath out. As he exhaled, he imagined the lid of the jar turning just a little. No force, no urgency, just enough space for the pressure to release naturally. The feeling would linger for a moment, like a cloud drifting slowly across the sky, but without resistance, it almost always began to soften on its own. The mind, it seemed, appreciated the quiet permission to stop fighting. Elias realized anyone could do this. Right now, even. Just pause for a few seconds. Name one feeling that's present. Breathe slowly once or twice, and imagine loosening the lid of the jar that has been holding it. What surprised him most wasn't that the feelings disappeared. It was that the mind, finally free from the struggle, began to relax all by itself, as if it had been waiting a very long time for this simple kindness. Weeks passed, and something subtle but meaningful began to change in Elias's days. Life itself hadn't become easier. People were still impatient sometimes. Disappointments still appeared without warning, and certain memories still carried a quiet ache. Yet the constant tension he once carried inside his mind had begun to soften. It was as if the jar he imagined within himself was no longer sealed shut. One evening he returned to the same park bench where he had first met the old man. The air was calm, the leaves whispering gently in the breeze above him. Elias placed the glass jar beside him and watched the sky slowly shift toward dusk, feeling a kind of quiet companionship with the world around him. He thought about all the emotions he had once tried to defeat. Anger, embarrassment, loneliness, disappointment. Each one had felt like a problem to solve, a weakness to remove, a storm to outrun. But now he understood something the old man had shown him without ever making it complicated. Feelings were never the enemy. The real struggle had always been the resistance around them, the tightening of the lid, the endless attempt to silence the heart so the mind could feel in control. Elias picked up the jar and gently loosened the lid again, just enough for it to move freely. The soft metal click made him smile. Such a small action, yet it carried the quiet wisdom he had been searching for all along. When the lid was allowed to loosen, the pressure inside didn't explode. It simply breathed, and in that simple space, between allowing and resisting, the mind finally discovered something it had forgotten how to do: relax.